Thank you, Terry and Paul. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I can tell you, we're all here in part because of a question, a dream, a vision. Only a young person who is naive to ways of the world works could have posed. That young person is Peter Westerhouse. About a decade ago, he was a kid who lived and breathed football. He was recruited as a star player to be a Gopher football player at U. But life threw a curveball. Life has a way of doing that. He was cut down by a disease called ulcerative colitis, disease of inflammation in the colon. And he had a really nasty case of it. His big, all-muscled frame was reduced to skin and bones. But his spirit was as strong as ever, and he fought a very hard fight. And during that fight, he asked a couple of deep questions. Again, questions only a naive young person could ask. One was, why is it that with all the millions of people affected by this disease, and there's about 1.5 million people with ulcerative colitis, and about 3 million people in the US with inflammatory bowel disease, why is it that we don't have a cure? Why is it just managed with expensive medicines that cost tens of millions of, tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars per patient, but no cures? And the second question, it just doesn't seem fair that out of all this misery that he's experienced, drug companies, hospitals, doctors, they're all making pretty good money, but he was still miserable. Didn't seem fair. Young people, they care about fairness. We adults are not so naive. We know life is not fair. And it's true, the heart of our medical system is a very cold capitalist engine. The goal is to make money, not to create cures. Many times, the system does work, and the profit and helping patients do align together. And we do have much better medicines and technologies than we did decades ago. And there are even some cures, like hepatitis C, for example. That used to be a chronic, devastating disease. Now we have a cure. But it's also true, he's right, when drug companies do develop their business plans, they prefer models of chronic disease that they can manage. It's a better business model. And cures, they do potentially kill the business model. So most people will still tell you, with warts and all, this is the best system possible, and there's no alternative. Well, I'll tell you, I respect that system. I'm part of that system a lot of the time. But there are alternatives, and this is not necessarily the first example by any means. I'll give you an example of cystic fibrosis. That's a disease that I actually do work with as well for a long time. So it's a genetic condition. The problem is forming mucus that's well hydrated. And because of the gene defect, the mucus is viscous, and it clogs up various tubes in our body. In people, it's lots of airways, but also in the intestine and other places. And the thing is, there's only about 30,000 patients with cystic fibrosis in the entire United States. And in the 1950s, the median life expectancy of a patient with cystic fibrosis was 15 years. Today, it's 42. And if somebody lives till 42, they're going to live another 20. And a child born with cystic fibrosis today can be told, you're probably going to live a normal lifespan. So, small disease, the fact is the drug companies didn't care about a market of 30,000 people. What happened there was a pediatric disease, is that the patient community organized. And they said, well, there's nobody for us. It's just us. So So they pooled their resources, they hired the best scientists, they set a goal. Their goal was that a person with cystic fibrosis is going to live a normal lifespan. It wasn't an easy journey. They made lots of incremental advances along the way. They still are. And every patient participates in research, usually more than one project. As far as research dollars being spent, compared to a disease like inflammatory bowel disease, it's like 100 to 1. They didn't push the drug companies away. They carried the initial research to get enough momentum, and the drugs were developed, and at that point, the drug companies did become interested. They had the intellectual property, they joined forces, the two models converged, it worked. I literally have patients with cystic fibrosis today who say, you know what, I never planned to live this long. I lived kind of dangerous life. I was like drinking and doing all kinds of stuff, and here I am. I was not prepared for this. So when Peter and his dad came to my office, we were working on a different disease. This was Difficile Infection, or C. diff. This disease is actually a complication of antibiotics, which long considered, still are, one of the greatest success stories in medicine. The problem is that our own bodies have microbes. We have very specialized, organized communities, primarily living in the intestine, that we coexist with. They're part of our body. People commonly know this as the gut microbiome. So when we take an antibiotic, you're just like throwing a grenade in there. You may be treating the infection, but you're also disrupting that normal. Happens to be fairly resilient and can withstand a lot of insults like this. But you do become vulnerable to problems like C. diff during a period of time, shortly after antibiotics. So that's an infection. It takes advantage of this disruption. And then once it settles in, it's very difficult to get rid of because it makes spores, and it can evade your therapies. And the standard therapies, guess what, is more antibiotics. That's what we do. We try to kill the C. diff. Problem is, you're also killing the normal microbes, which were holding C. diff at bay in the first place. And that's how people get into this cycle of recurrent infections. And so, it didn't take a genius to figure out what the solution is. The solution is to restore the balance. And that people thought of back in the 1950s, as soon as the antibiotics showed up. The cure did not need to be invented. It was already there. God and nature did all the hard work. Our task is to harness that power and bring the cure back, which is to reintroduce the microbes back. So I'm just going to fast forward. With the help of Achieving Cures Together, we build now a totally unique program. We manufacture different formulations of human, and these are human, gut microbes. They're derived from healthy donor stool. We do it with the strictest pharmaceutical standards called GMP manufacturing, good manufacturing practices, just like a drug company. We have a quality assurance department that goes over everything. And these processes have been approved by the FDA and can be used to treat C. diff patients and can be used in a variety of clinical trials. Turns out C. diff, a big disease as it is, unlike cystic fibrosis, 30,000 patients, about 500,000 patients a year get C. diff. About 100,000 get recurrent C. diff. I digress, but every time I see a patient, they tell me, "I've never heard of this. Am I the first one to get this?" People don't talk about diarrheal illnesses. Anyway, but what I'm trying to say is C. diff is actually just a canary in a coal mine. Turns out that gut microbiome is important for many things. It's an integral part of our physiology, and we've been neglecting it for decades throwing antibiotics, processed food, not really nourishing our microbes. And it's entirely possible that a lot of the modern diseases are in part, at least driven by this altered composition in the gut microbes. And so there's a lot of interest now in trying to repair that variety of diseases, ranging from autism to heart failure. And so, given that we are the only program, actually, that is manufacturing this material that FDA is accepting for clinical trials, our model is to let's collaborate with as many different investigators all over the United States so these trials can happen, to do this early research in order to drive mechanistic understanding and develop ways to repair the gut microbiome for these other applications today or someday. So over the last decade of our existence, with the help of Achieving Cures Together, we really have been the little engine that could. We treated, at this point, about 1,000 patients with C. diff infections. We did it free of charge for the actual medicine. And then we support all these trials. We have led and are leading the way. And in fact, drug companies have taken notice. They do like the work we did, and they thought this is actually a pretty good business model too. And so we can totally expect that probably within a year, after about a year, there will be drugs patterned on what we've done on the market. They're already being kind of priced at about $10,000 to $20,000 so an administration. And that's how the world works. There are investors who invested in the process to get to the approval, and they want to see a return on the investment. And this is a good story because this is still not well known, and the cure will be available to more patients. We know though in our system, about a good fraction, maybe a third, won't get that cure anyway because of the insurance blocks, because it's kind of too expensive and inaccessible. Things will fall through the cracks. So even for the sake of C. diff, I'd like our system to survive, to have a nonprofit alongside the Goliath, to have an option for even the C. diff patients. It also is the engine to drive further research into other areas. So again, we do support some very interesting trials. There is a work being done in Arizona on autism. I didn't think that was going to be anything, but it turned out to be a surprisingly interesting story. There are no medicines for autism. It's all kind of behavioral therapy and a lot of desperation. And we did some preliminary trial that was published in 2017 that showed that actually, it turns out that the microbiome of patients with autism is constricted. There's fewer microbes and it's just some derangement. And if we do fix that, their GI symptoms improve. A lot of the autistic patients have various problems with their gastrointestinal tract. And they can't quite verbalize the discomfort either. And so it looked like their GI symptoms improved and their behavior improved, possibly because they felt better. If your tummy hurts and you can't say much about it, maybe you're not going to behave that well. But it could be that there's also an axis between the microbes, gut, brain, through some neurotransmitters. That's also possible. Some of those kids actually had dramatic recoveries and went to university. So that's being currently in a randomized trial with the placebo controlled. That's one example. There are others. Right here at the university, we're doing a trial that's actually clicking at a pretty fast pace in patients who get bone marrow transplant. When you get that procedure, you get bombarded with antibiotics. Why? Because your immune system, and so your cancer has to be really rigorously treated. And along with that, trying to kill the cancer, you kill the immune system, and your gut is denuded because you got radiated and all that chemotherapy. It's the worst of combination you could put together. And so patients, unless their cancer returns, why do people die after that? A third dies because their cancer returns. The rest is non-cancer mortality. That's driven by infections. That's driven by so-called graft versus host disease. So what happens, actually, because of the damage, because of the antibiotics, and everything that we do, the residual microbes that are there are not friendly anymore, and so they invade, and that's a cause for infections. And the new immune system that develops after bone marrow transplant, in that context of being invaded all the time by microbes, lashes out, and that's graft versus host disease. So if we can repair the gut, we're likely to see far fewer complications of bone marrow transplant. We have a trial in heart failure, advanced liver disease, and we do have one in ulcerative colitis that's moving along. This was the initial ask of Peter, and that seems to be actually showing some promising results, at least from some patients. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. It's not as simple as C. diff to try to fix the microbiome, to shift the microbiome in a different context. And that's the science that needs to be done. So I invite you to join Peter's dream. All of us were young once. At one point or another, we all hope to make a difference. Most of us still do, but we kind of scaled down our dreams. I personally was the most fortunate person because I got to stay young, to live Peter's dream, make huge differences, to be able to treat 1,000 people. We accomplished a lot. But compared to what can be done, we're still a little seedling. But so I do invite you. Unfortunately, I have to also say that we're kind of in trouble. The COVID didn't leave us unscathed. Our model was that part comes from grants that we write as researchers at the university. Part comes from working with other groups who would pay us for the manufacturing that we do, and part comes from philanthropy. And during COVID, what happened is that unless you're working on COVID, your research was halted. It doesn't mean that you just tell everybody to go home. There's still work to be done. But that also means that the clinical trials that people were doing that were not COVID, they were halted, so they didn't need the product anymore. Everything came to a screeching halt. We did write some grants about COVID, but every single researcher was writing grants about COVID. It's a different angle. So 2.5% were funded. We actually had some good ideas, and some of that was supported later from other groups like in Hong Kong, that if you repair the gut microbiome, it looks like your COVID outcomes could be better. That was our idea. So we survived in no small part because of achieving Fierce together. But now we're kind of at this critical junction where I really hope we don't disappear by being squashed by this. So probably a very tender moment in our existence. I hate to end it on this kind of a plea note. Looking back, we achieved a lot over a decade. I think we can do a lot more. Thank you so much.